Well, I mean, the notion that there would be a literal incarnation of Ahriman was the suggestion that was posed by the esotericist Rudolf Steiner. I don't subscribe to that view. What I think is important in Steiner's analysis of how the diabolical works is that there are these two dimensions, the Aramanic and the Luciferian. Mm-hmm. The Luciferian being the diabolical dynamic that alienates us from the material world with which we are otherwise contiguous and coextensive, and the Aramanic, which enmeshes us and entangles us in an inordinate reliance on the material world, so that we become stupid, we become Philistine, we become obsessed with comfort and titillation, and that what Steiner recognized is that this twofold character of diabolical agency, it characterizes modern life, and modern people seem to oscillate in this terrible and chaotic way between the Aramanic and the Luciferian. So that's where I've taken some Steinerian observations and tried to apply them to a wider Catholic analysis of what's going on in modernity. Now, certainly what I do see in the modern world is excessive abstractionism. I think we are still very much trapped in prejudices, assumptions, and methodologies that come down to us from the Enlightenment and the rise of rationalism. And a lot of my work is about trying to return to the concrete and trying to return to a view of truth as unfolding through, unfolding through the historical process. And that's why I said at the end of my talk that that we ought not to simply think of truth as abstract or propositional. That is certainly it is certainly possible to access truth in such a way, but that's not exhaustive of how we come to know the truth and come to embody the truth. And unfortunately, modern man has lost a sense of accessing truth through a process of initiation. And as John Rao pointed out earlier today, a process of initiation so as to become a fully Catholic person is very much what this event is about. It's not simply listening to lectures, albeit that's a very important point, a very important aspect of it, but it's about building a community, it's about having meals together, it's about enjoying a place of extreme beauty, a landscape that was transformed by the presence of Christianity for 2 millennia here, and by a process of immersing oneself in what is going on here, one comes to not simply assent to certain truthful propositions, but actually begin to embody within oneself the truth as true living. So that's I was trying to bring various observations that would, in any case, strengthen what's already going on here at the Roman Forum.
I think when looking at that observation from Steiner, and you mentioned later in the talk about how it can be potentially realized, but of course we're speaking in an analogical way. We're not. I don't think personally. I don't know if one could even hold that there could be a literal incarnation of the devil, for example, in the same way that happened to our Lord. But I do see, especially with the advent of this technology that seems to be going to some extent haywire. There's some people with various beliefs about that here at the Roman Forum. But do you see that as being a threat of, well, we could see the use of AI, massive data collection being used against Catholics in that sort of anti-incarnational spirit that separates us from the real, that abstracts us from life, to the point where it might justify a more Luddite position of being anti this technology completely. Where do you see a Catholic having to draw the line at something like that? Because I think that's a major implication. If that's something that's we're seeing a sort of realization of that principle, of that Steinerian observation, where would you draw the line?
Well, it's very difficult to say. Whilst I have personally Luddite characteristics, I'm wary of technology. I find that each new technology, whilst it sometimes makes life more efficient or easier, it also comes with many, many dangers, right? And you can go back, I mean, sociologists and social historians have been thinking about this for decades, if not centuries. Things like the washing machine. You know, the washing machine absolutely gave mainly women about 30 to 35 hours a week that they didn't have. But it simultaneously atomized communities, because washing and drying clothing was a communal activity almost everywhere, right? And suddenly it was done by a machine, which meant that actually they didn't simply have 30 hours more free time, they just had 30 hours more to be subjected to an employer somewhere. So with each technology, certain benefits come, but also certain dangers. And those dangers are very often corrosive of a social web that has hitherto existed. Now, you definitely see that with smart technology, right? With smart technology, the assumption was always from the beginning that with smart technology would come about greater connectivity. You would be able to speak, you would have great social media, you would be commenting on all sorts of things, everyone would be in each other's lives all the time. Well, that might be true, but actually what's happened is that we've moved from concrete communities into online communities. So people spend far less time with each other than they used to, but they're spending far more time vicariously with people they don't actually know and constantly commenting on their lives. And the consequence of that is that we have a massive loneliness epidemic in the West, right? So I'm very, very cautious about each technology. So what does that mean? Well, it means that with each technology that comes along, somehow you have to be able to subordinate that technology to some kind of moral criticism. That is clearly not going on. It's clearly not going on. It hasn't been for a long time because, of course, in the modern world, no one can agree over what a kind of objective criticism from a moral standpoint would be in the first instance. Now, I mean, in the case of AI, it's already being applied in some very disturbing ways. And I think it does raise the question whether a technology like AI is going to accelerate a process which I think modernity is already characterized by, which is a process of enslaving us, okay? And, you know, this is a long-standing observation. Hilaire Belloc, famously in The Servile State, was showing how the move from a feudal society into a capitalist society had perhaps counterintuitively enslaving characteristics to it, that it stamped down entrepreneurialism, it prevented people from taking ownership of what they did have. So many people have noticed that transitions into certain conditions of life that have remained and have together accounted for whatever we denote with the word modernity has been a process of somehow enslaving us morally, enslaving us by being more dependent on power holders, etc., etc. Now, it doesn't take a lot of deliberation to see how AI could very much accelerate that kind of process. And that's why I think certain social critics, as I said earlier, people like Kingsnorth and Pajot and people who are commenting on popular forums, see AI potentially as a kind of incarnation of the diabolical, right? And that's how they've been speaking about it, like the devil giving himself a body through software, and then we're all enmeshed and embroiled in it. And like a lot of smart technology, like apps, like all of this stuff, what we tend to do is move very quickly into a situation in which you can't operate in the modern world. You can't even park your car unless you have that app or whatever. So what starts off as a convenience, if you want it, actually very quickly becomes a necessity, or you just can't function. And it just doesn't take a lot of deliberation to see how we're all going to get ensnared in this, unless we can at least agree on some common moral principles by which we might critique some of this technology.
No, certainly. And I think that's a great answer to it. Another thing that I think is important to get right when looking at your talk as a whole is, because you talked a lot about that Luciferian principle and getting that right. Well, there's been, speaking of Jonathan Pajot, somebody I know that's close to him is Father Stephen DeYoung. He runs the Lord of Spirits podcast. It's another big Orthodox podcast. And something he's brought up is that there does seem to be a consensus among a large part of the fathers that they saw the devil as having fallen through envy rather than pride, the envy of man. And that runs contrary, I think, to many of our understandings of that, especially because of Milton. I think that's in the Anglosphere's mind especially. But what do you make of that? What do you see as being the sin that caused the devil to fall? And how does that play into your understanding of that Luciferian principle?
Well, I think I'm being attacked by a mosquito. So Aquinas obviously says that it was because the devil realized that he would not access the beatific vision by virtue of his nature, but as a gift, as a grace, that he rebelled, and so it was pride. But you're absolutely right. Many of the fathers saw it as not just envy, but humiliation, that it was the binding of spirit and matter, of rational spirit and matter in man, that was judged to be undermining of the dignity of the angels. A passage that I read in my talk from Hildegard of Bingen in her book of Cures and Causes, it's called, is that in any case, however you want to understand the fall of Satan, in any case, he does have a particular hatred for the bond of matter and spirit in man. He has a particular hatred for that. And I use that to explain, in part, this Steinerian analysis of this desire to sever matter and form, right? And that's what I see going on in modernity all the time, as we oscillate between unanchored abstractions and a kind of rapacious attitude towards matter. So, we'll never know. There are competing theories. I tend to try and draw on them all together because I think that's how you get a more complete picture.
Yeah. As a final question playing into what do we do? I'm with you in seeing that there is that loneliness epidemic and how that is a result of technology that really hasn't been taken care of. But what would you say, is it necessary that we have getting back to that Luddite attitude, young men in particular, who I think that's affecting the most, trying to disconnect from technology completely, seeing it as something being too dangerous, Or on the practical level, do you think that we should look for solutions to how to better use the technology, understanding that it would just be too difficult? I mean, you mentioned how it's very difficult to have an anti-technological outlook on life and function in a modern society. Practically speaking, what do you recommend that young men facing that loneliness epidemic actually do, knowing that technology is a large problem of that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's an obligation on people to be extremely reflective about how technology is colonizing their lives in a deleterious way, and to act when it does. But I mean, I always say to people that you have to start doing concrete things. You have to get to good liturgy. You have to meet like-minded people and go for beers with them, and or go to restaurants with them or whatever. You need to you need to spend some amount of your money on accumulating a library of old, really good books, right? So that you can spend time not only in conversation with the living, but in conversation with those who built the civilization of which we're still the beneficiaries. And also, I always say to people, learn a skill, learn a really difficult skill, right? And actually, increasingly, I wonder whether we should be thinking professionally in those terms. I have a friend who has said to his children, we're going to find each of you a skill, a really difficult skill, that people probably still in 50, 60 years will still pay large amounts of money for this skill. So one of his children has become a thatcher, for example, because to thatch a house costs a fortune. And so basically you're going to end up working about 5 months of the year, always in beautiful weather, in a beautiful location, doing a skill that very few people can do, but that a large number of people in England at least still need, right? Yeah. And actually, if you're attending Holy Mass, if you're being sacramentally transformed, if you are becoming literate in the fundamental texts of your own civilization, if you are inducting yourself into a real community rather than an online community, and you're learning a really good skill, right, a hard to acquire skill, then you've become a person.